Hello, and welcome to Into the Abyss podcast. I'm doing another solo episode, and I'm going to try to do this one a little bit differently, breaking it up into maybe 2 or 3 parts and make it a little bit more digestible so you don't have to commit to a really long period of time to listen to a subject. And so this will be the first of a short series of episodes. My subject for this series of episodes will be the soul. And I should clarify that when I'm talking about the soul, I'm thinking of a particular notion of it, and it's a bit broader than what we usually think of. So not just something that's supernatural, something that's extra bodily, though I would include that as well in my notion of the soul. But I'm thinking of the more ancient Greek concept, psyche, of soul, which is what it is that animates and enlivens a living thing. What is that essence or principle? And so this is the way that Aristotle, in his book on the soul, Peripsyche, talked about the soul. And you may recognize that root psyche as in psychology. So in the discipline of psychology, we're not limiting ourselves to the supernatural understanding of the human person or the human mind. It's a more broad view of the whole human being. And in this episode, I want to approach this question using a thought experiment from a device in science fiction, which is the transporter, or teletransporter. So this is, we see it in a lot of different science fiction, but especially in Star Trek, right? So with the original series, it was Scotty who was beaming people up and beaming them to different locations. So the subjects would go onto a transport pad, and they'd be transported either from that transport pad to another transport pad, or maybe down to the surface of a planet. And probably just easiest to think of it from one transport pad to another. So it's transporting and teleportation, however you want to talk about it. But a person is being conveyed from one place to another with empty space in between, right? They're just instantaneously being moved. And so this is fictional, of course, but we can think about, okay, if something like this were to exist, how would it have to work? And I don't think you can get into this question without thinking about what is it that a person is. If you're going to transport a person from one place to another and skip across space, how are you going to do that? What are you going to preserve and then reconstitute in another location? So we'll look at a few models. So starting with the basic process, you have a person, this person's on a transport pad, and then something happens, they go through this transportation process. What happens in the middle? There's something that happens in the middle, and then on this other transport pad, the transportation process works in the reverse, and then you get the person back again. So one model is what I would call intact transport. And so in this model, there's no stage where the person's being dissolved in some way. The person's kept intact the whole time, and it's just being moved from one place to another. And it's pretty close to what would happen under normal circumstances when you're moving a person from one place to the next. Except, there must be some type of portal that skips what we would normally think of as space. So the one example from science fiction that comes to mind is Doctor Strange, where he opens up his portal and just steps through it. And in the last Avengers Endgame, when he opened up all those portals and people came from remote locations around the universe, it was basically just like they were stepping from one place to the next, but it moved them across the universe. But their bodies were intact the whole time. So that's one reason I would just call that intact transport. Another model would be transport of pieces. So it's there's physical matter that's being transmitted. The same atoms that are making up the person are being conveyed from one place to the next. They're just being disassembled and then reassembled. So that intermediate step would just be some type of atomized matter or disassembly to some extent. And one sort of science fiction slash fantasy example that comes to mind is Willy Wonka. So in Willy Wonka, Mike Teavee when he gets his comeuppance, they go into this room where Willy Wonka has a device that takes what was meant for candy and chocolate, breaks it up into 1,000,000 pieces, and then shoots those 1,000,000 pieces up into the air over their heads and then onto a TV screen, just smaller. So then they do the same thing with Mike TV. He's broken up into 1,000,000 pieces. They even look up in the air and see, hey, he's up there. He's in 1,000,000 pieces. And so that's kind of a transporter too. Basically, it's just moving the same matter, but just conveying it in parts. Then we get to what I would say is probably the orthodox or standard interpretation of the Star Trek transporter model, which I'll call informational transport. So here what's being transported is information. So the matter of the original person is not actually transported, like in Doctor Strange or in Willy Wonka. The matter of the person is either left behind or discarded, and matter at the target site is then used to rebuild the person. And how would this be done? What has to happen is you have to know how to rebuild the person. So what's sent is information, very, very detailed information, so that the person is either completely identical at an atomic level, or to the point that the person would be indistinguishable from the person at the point right before that. Then one last model that I'll mention, which I would say accommodates a more supernatural view of the soul. If you're really wanting to convey a person's true essence, and if there's something unique about that that is spiritual and supernatural, you're going to have to be able to send that through the transport. So I call it monadic transport. And so that's taking the idea of the philosopher Leibniz, that what a person is some non-reducible particle, some non-reducible essence called a monad. And so this would have to be moved around in some way. And, you know, I haven't seen this model explored as much exactly with a transporter, but since a monad, space and time is really something that in Leibniz's theory is imposed on our minds and produced by God. So our monad, our life essence, doesn't really exist in space-time, but space-time is something that is ideal. It's an idealistic model. So space-time is something that's in our mind. So it really wouldn't be a problem. You wouldn't even really need to be moving the monad through space, but you would be setting its perceived location in space from one position to another. But what's key is that what would be preserved in that transport would be that monad. Even if all the matter was different, even if the body were not even the same, if it were changed in some ways, as long as the monad were preserved, then it would be the same person in that transportation process. And the reason I bring up this thought experiment and the reason I find it interesting is because in each of these models, there's a corresponding theory of personal identity, which is basically the nature of the soul, and in the broad sense that I'm thinking of it. And let's think of this process generally again as either 5 steps or 3 steps. So you have a person on a transport pad. There's some process where they undergo this transport. Then in the middle, there's some process of transport moving from one location to the next. Then on the other transport, they're starting to be reconstituted, and then you end up with the person as you had them before, just in a different location. So then the question is, in that middle step, what's being preserved? What's invariant in that process? What is it that has to be conveyed so that you can say what you began with is what you end with? So let's look at these theories of personal identity. And I won't get into all of the conventional theories of identity that you would look at in a philosophy of mind class. I'm just going to look at the ones that are interesting for my purposes at the moment. And I'm going to use what I think is a fairly unorthodox taxonomy, because I have a different way of thinking about this than a lot of people probably do. So let's say there are 2 broad categories of personal identity. There's material and formal. So material, let's break this up into two pieces, or two different versions. So one is just that the person is the material body, and that's probably the most common that you see in science fiction. It's probably a very common view today, especially among people who are very scientifically literate, and it's just a common modern view. That once if you preserve all the matter that makes up a person, you've preserved the person, or you've moved one person from one place to the next. However, I also would consider that monadic transport view, the idea that there is some essence, even if it's spiritual, that has to be moved from one place to the next and has to be preserved. I think of that as kind of material as well, although I know we're definitely stretching the meanings of those terms pretty radically. But the point being that there's some kind of stuff, right? There's some, even if it's supernatural, there's some kind of stuff there that has to be made, right? And so one objection I could see to from the view that there is some type of supernatural soul is, say that you took a person in a transporter and dissolved their body up, and atomized it, but then transmitted the information. A few things could happen from the view of from the supernatural view of the soul, right? So on the other transporter pad, you could get all the matter back that was originally there, but it would be a dead person because the soul wouldn't be there. You killed the person when you atomized that person, that they died, and you can't get it back. Or maybe you do get a person, you do get a living person, but it's not the same person. It's a new soul, right? Because you neglected to transport that monad, that vital life essence, that soul in the conventional sense that's more supernatural than what I'm talking about here. So it's a something that needs to be moved. So I kind of think of that in the material category in a very broad sense, in the expanded sense that I'm talking about here. And that's why I say this is kind of unorthodox. This is very much a Todd view. Okay, so those are two material views of personal identity. Then there's the formal view. And that is that the person, what constitutes a person is the form or information. And I would want to say that this is not a material essence, right? And this is what I call the orthodox Star Trek view. We would normally think of it as very materialistic, right? Okay, yeah, you as long as you take all the information of the organization and the way all the atoms were put together and all the molecules were organized in the brain states, and then rebuild those. You could use completely different atoms, completely different matter in another location, but as long as you put it back together the same way, voila, you have the same person. It's indistinguishable. Now, on the face of it, that does seem materialistic, but the matter is not what is preserved in that. It's the information that's conveyed. And information, there's what I've talked about, a spectrum of materiality. Okay, maybe we could consider it material in a certain sense, but it's quite abstract, right? Usually we would think of these arrangements, the information of the way things are put together is not material itself. It's something that is standing over and above the actual material. So with my unorthodox taxonomy in mind, let me just review each of these different models of the transport again, and kind of touch on these points. So intact transport, the person is the material. So intact teletransportation, it's similar to regular transportation in a way. It's just a little bit more fancy, right? There's some type of portal that opens up, and we're able to... outside of that, it looks like the person's just being moved instantaneously from one point to the next. But other than that, it's just the same material that's being conveyed. Transportation in pieces, again, it's the material that's being transported, right? It's just being taken apart, put back together. I say just as if it were something simple. Of course, we have no idea how to do that. But still, it's the person, right? The same, it's the matter. The same molecules and atoms that were there are being taken apart and moved and then put back together. So at least as a state function of looking at the starting starting result and the end result, it's similar to regular transportation in that you're just moving all the atoms from one place to the next. And then in monadic transport, in this case, it's not the regular material it's not the natural material that's being moved, but there is still a thing that's being moved. The supernatural stuff, the essential life essence. Even if we look at this as some kind of dualism, right? That there's natural matter and there's supernatural stuff of some kind. That thing is needing to be moved, or at least given some different index in space-time in order to do the transport. Okay, and then lastly, informational transport. This one is the one that I see as radically and qualitatively different from the others, because there's no stuff, or if it's stuff, it's a very, very abstract kind of stuff. It's this is just the information that's showing the relations of the particles making up the person, either that or the wave function, or however we want to describe it, that this information is being transmitted. The material that was being used, the material from the body of the original person, is destroyed or dissolved, atomized, and then different material is being taken up at a different location using that information. What is invariant is the information, which, if it is stuff, is only stuff in a thoroughly abstract sense. So since the informational model is the kind of orthodox view, I'll focus on that one. And there's some interesting problems that come about with this. I think the basic concern, and I think a legitimate concern certainly, is that you're basically killing the person, potentially, right? As they go into this transporter, as you atomize them. If the person weren't being reconstituted in another location, it would certainly look like murder. And is this reconstitution really a preservation of the original person? That's the major question, right? So one way of thinking about it is that you're basically creating a duplicate and killing the original. So it's sort of, it's exactly the same as the Prestige. So in the Prestige, Hugh Jackman's character, he goes and sees Nikola Tesla, and he's trying to create this ultimate magic trick, right? And spoiler alert, sorry if you haven't seen the movie, but basically what happens is that they create this machine that duplicates Hugh Jackman's character, and so he goes into this machine, he goes on stage, and his duplicate appears in a different location in the theater, so it looks like he's being teletransported. And then what's happening is that the duplicate, while the duplicate is reappearing in another part of the theater, the original is dropped below stage into a container of water, and it's sealed, and the original person drowns. So you're left with only one person, so you don't get a bunch of proliferating magicians. It's this horrific realization in the movie. But in the transport problem, we that's kind of brushed over the side because the original matter is just, they don't really say what happens to it. But you could think about it. It is interesting to ask what does happen to the matter? Is it incinerated? Where does it go? And I heard another way of looking at this is say you were going into a transport, and they take all the information, they send that information off, and then your duplicate's sent over, but then something goes wrong where the body, original body, is not destroyed, and so the Scotty on the transporter panel says, sorry, something went wrong. You're still here, but don't worry, your duplicate made it safely to the other location. Just hold on a moment, and we'll go ahead and atomize you. Would that be comforting? Not really. It presents some challenges, right? Not only for the way the transporter works, which, that's fictional, but also it's an interesting question is, what is it that makes up the soul, and what would this mean? And then another question, which I think that example brings up, is it really you? Is it really you that's sent over there, right? So if the person who is over there has the same exact brain states and everything right before, so it would have all the same memories and everything, but it could arguably be a different person. And there's actually a great example of this from Star Trek. So there's an episode where, this is in The Next Generation, where Commander William Riker, before he was on the Enterprise and he was a lower ranking officer, he was on some mission and the transporter malfunctioned, and so he was duplicated, and so the Commander Riker that we know was teleported back to where he was supposed to be, but then his duplicate was left on location and abandoned, and then they find each other years later, and they're completely different people. They started off exactly the same, but over the years, because of their different experiences, and you can imagine this one guy was left alone for years with no one to talk to, so he was left a little bit bitter and had a different type of personality, completely different life story from that point on, and they were different people. Were they, just right after that transport, were they the same person in different bodies? So that's another question. Is it really you that's being transported? Because in that case, the first person could have been left alive, right? The person at the first end of the transport could have been left alive, but was not. But then I think this brings up more general questions, even apart from the transporter problem, because what we are changes constantly, right? So if you take the organization of your body and your brain at any one moment, it changes in the next moment, and especially over long periods of time, we are very different than the way we were. So an adult and a child, in a sense, it could be thought of as not the same person because they are so different. There's continuity there, definitely, and that's the reason that we consider them the same person. But if you think of, if we're bothered, for people to think about these things like me, if I'm bothered by the question of whether a person is the same person going into and coming out of a transporter, maybe it's also relevant to ask, to what extent is a person the same person just from moment to moment or from year to year? Okay, but do those options, those models in the transporter problem and those theories of identity, do those exhaust our options? That the material categories and the formal category, does that cover everything? I think not, and so that's what I'm going to get into in later episodes. That I think there are other options of what it is that constitutes the soul of the human person. And that it's not either material or either formal, but rather a hybrid of the two. And this is the view that I'm attributing especially to Aristotle. And to give a bit of a preview, just getting into the Greek here, the matter in Greek is hule, and form is morphe. The view that Aristotle puts forward we now call hylomorphism. So it's a combination of the two, that to adequately describe the soul, you have to address both the material and the formal elements. But I'll save that for the next episode. So I'll wrap it up here for now, and I will see you next time.